Our next panel is on event and user data, and we'll look into the many battlegrounds around the ownership, collection, storage, transfer, and monetization of data generated by and from sports events. To discuss this, I'd like to invite on stage Mr. Srinivvasan Gopalakrishnan, Head of Strategy at Reliance Sports, Vidushi Marda, Digital Program Officer at Article 19, Abhinav Shrivastava, Counsel at LawNK, Chiraag Paul, Founder and CEO of Proem Sports Analytics, and to moderate the session, Nandan Kamath, Director of the SLPC.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for joining us. I think we originally were going to play a T20, but now we're under Duckworth-Lewis rules because I think our heat sensors on our audience have shown great hunger. But thankfully, I have some big hitters here who are going to give you some food for thought on this very important topic of event data as well as fan data. So I think we're really transitioning from collecting data from athletes, their performances, to all of this now having been aggregated into an organized sports event, and that event having to be commercialized and taken to the public. Srini, if I may start with you specifically, you see this whole issue about controlling what emanates from an event, scores, broadcast, in some cases even the photos. What is really driving that? Is it the commerce of sport and the need to make sure every last rupee is made from that sport? Or is there also an element of wanting to control the narrative, to give meaning and to control the meaning that people take from this event and to curate that in a very specific and controlled environment? And I think, just to be clear, all of us are speaking in personal capacities. We represent different interests and companies, but here bringing all of your experiences working for multiple different organizations and event organizers. So just if you can bring that perspective in.
I think it's what all you said, and also a lot more. Because in India, especially say in an event, more than control or anything, I think it's a lot more basic. When you said either control or cultural, because in India, I think we build viewers and not fans. Yeah, viewers are fickle; they come and go. Yeah, but fans stay with you forever. All viewers are fans, but all fans are viewers, but all viewers are not fans. So I think that's the problem most sports face in this country. They're saying we don't have fans, but somebody has to try and build fans. A lot of fans exist. So to build fans, you need to speak to them. Yeah, and to build sport in the country, you need to build fans, and to build fans, you need data. Unless and until you get data, you will never be able to build fans and speak to them one-on-one. Otherwise, it will be the promos that you see on TV saying, "Come watch the Lions face the Tigers at 7:30." I know that. Yeah, I mean, treat me with a little more respect. And there are multiple types of fans. So to sort of segment them and speak to them, depending on which level each one of those are, I think that is the core. Rather, because right now everybody seems to be doing everything and a lot of things, rather than focusing on something which is slightly more basic. And we're trying to do that with the extremely well-dressed gentleman on my left.
No, but also taking that a step further. So we see now heavily curated events where you're watching the broadcast. The commentary is also produced by the person organizing the event. There's very limited views for in some sense, the public voice to even be heard. You're not even allowed to criticize umpires. So in some sense, is it overdoing the control and taking that fan for granted, where you're treating them too much as a viewer and not accepting that a fan may have opinions, fan may have interests that are to be represented on that broadcast? It's almost a linear, this is my message, and then you're trying to have the message heard in the way that you want it to. Now, is that a fair balance? Do you feel like the public interest is adequately represented when these public events are being taken out? Is there an independent voice being heard in the intermediate? Or is it, this is my finished product, now you do what you will with it?
Absolutely. I don't think there is a representation at all. Because if you look at it from multiple perspectives, whether you're a rights holder or you're a broadcaster or you're a club or a federation or a league, all of them have very, very different messages or narratives which we communicate to fans. which is fair. But I was doing a small exercise when I came, and which sort of takes me back to my earlier point also, and to the question that you raised. I'm probably the only one wearing a Mumbai Indians jersey shirt here. Yeah, I'm not surprised. Even my team is not wearing Mumbai Indians. Yeah. What's more surprising is I don't see any RCB jerseys. Yeah. But what I'm happy to see is I see a couple of BFC jerseys and a lot of Manchester United, Arsenal. I'm surprised Arsenal also, but but a lot of Manchester United, Chelsea, Real Madrid, etc. You know why? Because they speak to us. Yeah, and we are not building fans. Like I said, we build viewers. Indian clubs, Indian teams need to speak to their fans. Yeah, different types of fans. The guy who sees every match of mine, the guy who sees one match. Both are fans, albeit at different levels. So I think that's once that connection happens, the feedback happens. That consumer voice is heard. By the league, by the team, by the federation, by whoever. But right now there is no mechanism. Even if you look at the Indian cricket team, yeah, how many fans for the Indian cricket team? You'll get numbers on Facebook, but those are not fans. Those are earned fans, not known fans.
Chiraag, if I may come to you, so you have this notion of the fan now being engaged. So you're saying, I'll listen to you, I want to take feedback from you, and I want all of this rich data, and as a result, I'm going to commercialize this relationship even more, which is perhaps not the said, but the unsaid and unspoken bits of the motivations. When you have someone engaged, they also suddenly start asking for things, right? So where do you see this going in terms of the engaged fan and the rights of fans going forward? People who are engaging with the event, the rights to take data, remix it. Do we have a future where the broadcast comes out and anyone can add commentary on top of it, for example? What is the engaged fan going to look like if you were to be predictive in, let's say, a 5 or 10 year period? And how are sports bodies going to and should respond to that more engaged fan who's asking for more? Because when you're being taken from, you are going to take back as well, right?
First of all, thank you for having me here. I missed the memo about how we should be attired, so which is why I am the way I am. But to answer your question, Nandan, I think the technology in terms of, for a broadcaster, to use the example that you just used, can a fan sitting watching the game, whatever game that's going on, can they comment? The technology exists. The feasibility of it in terms of all the logistics of it exists, but the understanding of the fan as to whether they can utilize or engage with the broadcast, but more importantly, what sort of data is he or she providing or collecting, that realization does not exist right now. To go back to the previous panel, when we're talking about players themselves don't quite know exactly what consent they're giving out. And we're talking about a country where there are several languages and each state behaves like a different country. So to expect a fan to know that, I don't think that's a 2 to 5 year plan. I think that's a longer plan. I mean, even in the West or elsewhere, the fan is also growing and understanding. The fan is very clever, and we need to respect that. However, as it is with the corporations or any of the clients that we work with, we're all learning in this process. And with the one thing that I see is constant, regardless of which panel we might speak in or listen to, is knowing the importance of understanding data. Srini mentioned about knowing who the fan is in terms of profiling them, and it's not just about commercializing. And like you said, it's probably a long-term thought about commercializing. We're not there yet, rightly so. But knowing who they are, and by knowing who they are, I don't mean by knowing their names and email addresses only, but knowing their behavioral patterns, knowing why they choose to do something and not, the opportunity cost. Why have they not chosen to follow another team? We might have United, Chelsea, Arsenal fans, but they're very clear in their approach that if you are not a supporter of Arsenal, which I hope most people are not, I don't understand why they would be, but if you're not a supporter of Arsenal, are they still a club that you would watch when they're playing a different team, which might not be your team? Barcelona was very, very clear, or has been very clear in their Asian sort of capacity and our relationship with them, that we want to be the second most favorite team for any sport fan. So you'll have you'll follow India, you might follow United, but when Barcelona's playing, I want to watch the game. It's not because I'm a Barcelona fan, but I enjoy how they play, and that's why I want to watch them. So I think clubs and organizations are becoming far, far more clever, as are the fans, in terms of understanding the use and importance of data. How we use it to commercialize it is, again, a step which is ongoing, and it changes depending on which region. I can speak from a personal perspective and from Proem's perspective. It depends really on the region that we're working in. GDPR compliances in certain places, and in certain places you might not have it. So for us sitting as, which I dislike calling it that, but we're kind of in the middle of things, in between a league, a sponsor, or a club, and then on the other side where it could be a data provider in terms of a vendor, whether it's a ticketing platform or any other platform. And we need data from both sides in order to provide analytics to better your decision making. That's all we're trying to do, to better the understanding of your consumer base. So that conversation is a conversation that we would like to facilitate between all parties, regardless of region. And we are getting more successful at doing that, especially here in India. And what I would say within the last couple of years, which is different from this particular year, because of the number of leagues that have generated and started just over the last decade. IPL might have been around for 12, 13 seasons. ISL is going to go into its 5th, 6th season, but there are several other leagues which have just started, even if they're 3-day leagues or 5-day leagues. There's an awareness of trying to grow the sport, whether it's through grassroots or at a high level. And there is a very, very clear awareness that if we need to grow the sport, we need to grow talent, but we also need to be able to grow talent and viewership by the use of data. So I'm very optimistic, and we've seen that change over the last few years, and the conversations we're having are far more unique, which we're very happy with.
Sure. Thank you, Chiraag. Abhinav, if I may come to you on the legal front. When you look at an event and the things that emerge from that event, it could be broadcast, it could be photos, it could be data and match streams. What is under Indian law protectable and controllable? And what is, when someone is trying to protect it and control it, actually overreach? If you could just give us a brief elaboration of where things stand today under data laws, copyright laws, broadcast laws.
So the thing with event data, and when looking at a sports event, there are a number of streams of data that emerge out of it. You have the broadcast stream, which is regulated by copyright. You have the underlying statistics, which contain a factual element, which is the factual datum that underlies the statistics, as well as the tangible record that's created of the statistic. So there's a differential treatment of both. So when you're looking at sports data, there's not one single regulatory regime that applies and clarifies the manner in which rights operate. Along with so let's take the example of broadcast. Now with broadcasts, the underlying stream itself, it's irrelevant whether that is subject to copyright or not. But the stream is subject to protection, and there's an exclusivity that attaches to the stream. So the broadcaster, the person who's created that stream and is disseminating it, has a right to control and authorize the manner in which that stream is used. This right is independent of the underlying content. It could be a performance, in which case the underlying content is copyrightable, or it could be a sports event, in which case the underlying content comprises of a number of facts together. So it's an observable fact which is not capable of copyright. Now, when we move to match statistics, the statistic element itself, the factual datum, is public knowledge. So that is not capable of protection under copyright. But the moment you render that in a database, in that case, the database itself is a tangible record. So the creation of that database gives you certain rights.
But what about scores and live scores? I think it's a hot topic.
So live scores is where the conflict is rising, because conceptually there is an issue of how we view event data. Do we view it as a resource, or do we view it as a public good? The moment there's greater conceptual clarity on what's needed, the conflict gets addressed. Right now, the hot news doctrine is a via media that exists to recognize, it's sort of like a hybrid between ownership as well as public access. So what it does is that there's recognition that the score itself is not capable of protection under any of these regulatory regimes, but there's recognition that there's value in the score while it is live. So that's why the hot news doctrine is often employed to provide preference, like a right of first use to the event organizer over the live data. Now, there are questions about what is the reasonable period after which it does go into the public domain. Is it 3 minutes? Is it 15 minutes? Is it 30 minutes? And it varies from sport to sport and the number of memorable moments that might be in a sport. But fundamentally, there's a via media to address two different constituencies. The event owner who's seeking to monetize that data and live access to that data, and the public, which has a right to know that information, because sports events are increasingly involve public engagement. And that is where the conflict arises. Now, in the US, for example, the PGA has been successful in claiming an ownership interest in the live data. So there's been recognition by the Court of Appeals that there is a window within which that live data is exclusive to the PGA. This is not so the case in Europe. In Europe, to some extent, copyright law applies where a database is created. But over the factual datum itself, there's very little recognition of a hot news doctrine. And there, competition law has a greater impact, especially in the case of program guides, where the commission has, through competition law, effected a compulsory license that's now available to every program guide creator over the program guide itself. So it's a very interesting
Abhinav, I mean, from what you're saying, essentially the creator of the event owns everything till certain rights are eaten away. Is that the way law should work? Should it be, in some sense, this is not a language of rights. This is a language of access to someone else's rights. Is there any conversation on the public's rights to know, the public's rights to use, the public rights to view and consume and remix to some extent? And more importantly, does it differ when this is a private event versus a public event versus a national team participating versus, let's say, an IPL? Does it and should it change the analysis?
So if we're looking at private events and public events, then the amount of control that an event organizer has over the event varies greatly. A public event has greater engagement with the public, and it's also to a great extent seen as the data that arises seen as a public resource. That's something, it is data over which the public has a right of access. Whereas with a private event, the commercial interest and the rights of the event organizer are given greater recognition.
But once that is broadcast, you probably move into the realm of a general public event as well, right?
Yeah, so once that is broadcast, it does move in, the facts that underlie that broadcast do move into the public event.
Vidushi, if I may come to you, I think you're at the end of this discussion on what is possible. What can sport and all of this industry in terms of dealing with fans, dealing with big data, dealing with behavioral data learn from what the conversations going on AI and ethics? It's something that you work on deeply. What are the cross learnings that we can bring to sport? What are the cautionary tales one should be aware of at this stage, where I'd say that the thrust right now is on let's see what's possible, let's do everything possible, and then we'll look at the safeguards. Is that the right way to think about it?
I would say absolutely not. So I want to talk about a few assumptions that I've heard through all the sessions this morning and why I think we need to be a bit more critical of them. So the first is data ownership, right? We've heard that many times, that who owns the data, who collects the data. Let me use an analogy, right? You can own a piece of land. I can own a piece of land and I can sell you that piece of land. I can sell you or I can rent it out to you. Right? I can gift it to my best friend. Once I sell you the land, for instance, I don't care if the soil on that land doesn't work because I've sold it to you, right? I have no skin in the game anymore. Data cannot be owned. This is something that even the biggest data companies around the world are reckoning with now, in that if you collect my personal data, you collecting it doesn't make me any less the owner. In fact, the converse is true. The minute someone else knows about my data, it becomes more valuable to me. Right? So that alienation concept around data, particularly when we're talking about user data, I think needs to be rethought of, especially because, legislation around the world is rejecting this idea. Right? Indian data protection law rejected this idea outright. The Sri Krishna committee said that data is not something that should, can, or will ever be owned. Right? If you collect data about someone, you're doing so in a position of trust, as we heard in the morning. So that's the first thing, where you think about data not as just something you collect and see what happens, right? That one of the things that has made me cringe the most in the last year is when I was at a conference in Africa and someone said, data is the new oil is like an overused thing. Data is the new air because it's everywhere and you can collect it and everyone has it and everyone can sort of store it. And the thing is that we're not thinking about it critically enough, because the second cautionary tale I would say is that we assume that more data equals more efficiency equals more information, right? We're actually learning that systems that crunch this data are actually very clunky, right? They don't work as well as we think they do. Google's face recognition algorithm 4 years ago, I think, in a controlled laboratory setting, confused an African-American person for a gorilla, right? And this is perhaps the biggest company in the world in a controlled setting where you had your test data and evaluation data in the same place, and it still makes mistakes. And also, I think when we think about emerging technology, there's often this assumption that we should use it, right? And again, I have an analogy, like if you were going on a holiday and you're going to take a bus, right? You're going to ask, okay, where's this bus going? Is my driver sober? Does the brake work? Is the road good, right? When it comes to AI, I feel like we're not asking those questions. What do you want to use this technology towards, right? Does it work? What are the limitations of this technology? And one of the most dangerous limitations that I see is that machine learning as it works now assumes that past data is a good indicator of future data, of future, occurrences, right? So by definition, anything that deviates from the norm is considered noise by the machine, right? So say, 10 years ago, not many women played sport, right? Maybe conversations, and I don't know, but this is just an example, please correct me if I'm wrong, but maybe, LGBTQ rights were not a conversation. Maybe kabaddi was something that we joked about and we didn't actually take seriously. The data will tell you that this will not happen in the future, but the truth is sport is amazing because it is unpredictable, right? The people that you can get into an arena, who would have thought that India would have its own football league 5 years ago, 10 years ago, right? Data can predict things based on the past, but do we really want to replicate the past? I can give you an example with fan data, because I did a bit of research to see how AI is being used, right? And I think one of the things that's happening, I don't know if it's happening in India, but I think abroad there's this conversation around verified fans, right? So if someone is very loyal to your team, then you will, give them tickets or merchandise or whatever. So let's look at this, take aside the sports, just look at it from a technical perspective for 1 minute, right? A verified fan will be someone who is reliable, who comes to games, I was going to say shows, to games often, right? Who has bought merchandise in the past, is reliable, has never been a no-show. And then you take a step back and say, what is this a proxy for? This is a proxy for privileged people who could buy tickets in the past, who know English, right? Who can speak English, who can use online payment services. But the people who may want to come to your game are not those people, maybe, right? So it's actually quite exclusionary, and it takes structural inequality and makes it much worse, because we have this veneer of, it's a system, right? It's telling us, it's giving us stats, and it's analyzing data, and this is great. But the question is, if you do want to grow the sport, right? We were talking about how exclusionary it is for athletes who don't speak a certain language, right? Having technology without a critical understanding of the society in which it is being imposed, I think, is very dangerous. And so I would say, let's not do that. And one last thing is, I think many event organizers say, okay, we want to make the sport, the experience of going to your first game very efficient, right? So let's use facial recognition. You don't have to worry about a ticket. You have shorter lines. But actually, the system doesn't work well for vulnerable people. This is something that senators in California have learned. This is something that is very, very trite almost to say in the field of AI and diversity. So say we're using facial recognition and it doesn't identify women correctly, or doesn't identify transgender people. B, what is happening with the data? Right? We don't have data protection law yet. So if you're giving your most intimate detail, you can't reasonably change your face. What is happening in the absence of purpose limitation? How do I know you're not going to sell it to someone who wants to harm me? How do I know you're not going to sell it to someone who wants to check if AI can detect my sexual orientation? So I think also understanding that, Cambridge Analytica did not start out with saying we're going to change elections. It was built on a system that said, we're going to collect data to give you a better experience on this platform. And I'll stop there. Maybe you can talk more.
No, I think fantastic points. And Srini, I think this is food for thought of, is it too early in some sense to start profiling and segmenting fans, given the Indian sports journey is still far from being fully written? Take the example of the IPL. The audiences of today could have no way been predicted 10 years in the past. If we spent the first 2 years of the IPL just trying to sell to the people who are already watching the IPL, I don't think the IPL would have been where it was with young audiences, with women and other things. What is the caution that as event organizers one must take in using the right amounts of data points but not overdoing the analysis and strategic decision making based on data? And I say that again with simply knowing where the state of play is with Indian sport, Indian audiences, and Indian, I would say, fan building, viewership to fan conversion.
So I think, as even Vidushi mentioned, I think it's a long journey. Yeah. Could we have predicted what IPL has become? Never. Yeah. Not with data, not with gut, not even astrology. Yeah. Now, I think it needs to start, and it's a slow process. I'll give you 2 examples. One is, of course, IPL, and I represent a team, the Mumbai Indians, which pretty much has the highest viewership, the highest following, etc. But even we don't use data to the extent that we should be using. We use it for player performance, but we don't use it for fans. It's just now in the 11th year that we are starting to, that we started to sort of, profile fans, segment fans, and are very careful of giving them, of overloading them with information. We segment them into, even if you sort of do a 3x3, and like she mentioned, I mean, we classify them as avid fans and followers, just to sort of, put it in a simple way. And on the other side of the axis would be, earned fans, owned fans, and known fans. So again, here itself, it's just a 3x3, and as we move along, it will become 4x4, 5x5, 6x6 grid. As fans grow, fans are growing, but as we collect that data and therefore serve the right kind of information that is, required for a fan of that profile. Yeah. Now cut to something like an ISL, which also we run and is relatively new. The fan type is not the ones who come to IPL. It's very different. It is the guy who buys a 50 rupee ticket. An IPL fan, the lowest ticket is 750 rupees. Right? So again, will that guy respond to a cool email or a GIF image? They may not. They may still have a feature, they may have a smartphone, but they may respond only on WhatsApp, not on social media. So again, while the grid might be the same, an avid in Northeast or an avid in Kerala might be very different from an avid staying in Thane following Mumbai Indians. So I think the steps are slow, and each sport sort of needs to navigate its own way, and it will take at least 8 to 10 years, in my opinion.
And how has that been different, seeing the journey of the IPL and the ISL? How would you differentiate the fan journeys in some sense? So one is a sport which had millions of fans, you plugged in a new format. In some sense, the other is one which has obviously legacy fans, but is actually trying to build the sport's following as well. And how are those fan journeys in some sense of the governing body and the fan, how have those have to be curated differently?
We got it absolutely wrong in the first year. We thought nobody will come to Guwahati and the stadium was full. We thought nobody will come to Kerala and every match goes full. We thought a lot of people will come to Delhi, but nobody came. So, but it's very different because while we've learned along the way as far as football is concerned, because the fans are very different. They consume very differently. They relate to the sport very differently, and even the 5th year, we're still learning as to what the profiles of these fans are, depending on what the cultures, what backgrounds they come from, how do they perceive the sport, and how they sort of, how does it fit into their social and cultural ecosystem.
Got it. Chirag, in terms of your service, how much room is there for this personalization of knowing, overlaying data on demographics, overlaying it on nature of sport, overlaying it on the way that you see the industry growing and people responding to it?
I think, first of all, understanding where data is coming from is very important to us, because that's how, before we can amalgamate any data set. So understanding and profiling would begin from figuring out various data sets, where they're coming from, putting them together, and then trying to find patterns between them. One of the big factors, like Vidushi mentioned as well, that especially with social media, it's become far more difficult for analytics to be provided or to amalgamate social media data with other data sets for ticketing, membership, etc., because of privacy laws and whatever, Cambridge Analytica and everything that stemmed from there. But we've been able to do that far better because of this understanding of the use of data, especially from event organizers and clubs, and they're starting to understand why data is important in order to. It's not about, like I said, it's not about commercializing the fan per se right now. It's about understanding and knowing them better. I agree that historical data does not tell you where you're going to be, which is why we don't use predictive analytics that much as you would probably use with player performance, where predictive analytics is actually, because that's the sample size is just one. Here the sample size is far larger. So we don't do predictive analytics as much. What we try and do is, in order to validate whatever strategies or positioning or how you deliver content, we use historical data to try and see where we can stand in the next year or the next season, and then go back and change that model, because you're going to make mistakes. The underlying factor is we are going to make mistakes. We're going to make mistakes because what AI at this point can't do, or has not been able to do, or might be able to do in future, is to understand human behavior. That's extremely difficult, extremely difficult. So we don't really go towards that tech. Sport and entertainment is a very different game altogether in terms of any other industry. Finding out consumer behavior when it comes to retail is very different, or food tech is very different from what you would see in sport and entertainment, because at the end of the day, and again, I go back to the Arsenal analogy. They don't perform well, but you'll still find people here wearing Arsenal jerseys. But if you gave a discount on a product, even if you've used that product for the last few years, you wouldn't mind switching products and going somewhere else. I'm talking about retail or any other thing. So sport is very unique in that sense. So we use analytics or historical data to a certain extent to guide us in the right path. The path might be right or might not be right. We find that out whilst we're on that path. But more importantly, we have a clearer picture as to what those opportunities might be. And in terms of understanding on where, to go back to your question about how we're actually amalgamating data sets, it's a difficult task. Data sciences have been around for a long time. It's not, we're not reinventing the wheel. What we're trying to do is to try and make it more contained and more refined to sports and entertainment, because at the end of the day, everyone loves sport. What Abhinav was mentioning in terms of sharing data with the PGA case and etc. That's great from the event producer's perspective, but the viewer at the end of the day is what drives anything in this industry. The viewer, the fan, who we're trying to bring the viewer and making them into a fan, they drive everything. Yeah, sponsorship might be the largest revenue generator for a club or a league, but at the end of the day, that sponsor is going to have a deal with you for 3 years based on the relationship, maybe extend, maybe not. But a fan sticks with you, not just through his or her life journey, but also influences people within their family or elsewhere. So that's why we keep going back to the fan, or keep going back to the viewer to try and understand. And that, so when we do amalgamate data, it's done in a very cautious way.
Got it. Abhinav, just to conclude, in terms of working with a sports body to recognize what should be kept exclusive, and perhaps some rights have non-exclusive futures, what is the thought process one would go through, and how would you advise an event organizer on really separating the wheat from the chaff in terms of knowing what is at the core of the sports business model, what is worth controlling, and what is really collateral stuff which actually you might want other businesses to actually build for you, allow the fanhood to. You don't have to control your fan. You need to build the bases on which fans are going to get built. So how do you build that recognition that some things are vital? Yes, they're vital to control and commercialize, while others you may be better off handing over onto others. Things like fantasy sport, journalism, maybe even betting and other aspects which are collateral and perhaps have feedback loops.
So the first step when we're looking at advising a sports body and a sports body, now when a sports body comes to us, they have a significant investment in the game. So in the initial stages, they will be looking to monetize everything. That's not necessarily in their interest. So the first step is to identify their expectations and address those. Is their expectation to control the entire event? Because that will not work, and you'll also alienate fans. It's equally important for the sports body to grow the sport through not just encouraging more participation, but also encouraging more fans and viewers to participate in the event and the event data.
And conversations.
So it's important to essentially create two silos. One silo of those expectations that are key and critical to the event organizer, and which play a key part in securing its investment in the sports event. Broadcast, sponsorship, association. These are commercial interests and commercial rights that are key to ensure that the sport is sustainable and the investment in the sport continues to bear fruit. On the other hand,
now a lot of the conversations Abhinav happen, but that person is making money off me. Now, is that the right guide? Is it wrong for a collateral business to also be making money from something that I've created? And is that the standard? Because the more and more we see people objecting to wrongful gain, it doesn't matter whether I own it or not, but I've put in the effort and someone else is making money off that. And we hear this conversation quite often in collateral businesses. Is that, do we have to move away from that theory of other businesses shouldn't build?
So rather than move away from the theory, we have to change the mindset. The idea is the collateral user is not making an unfair or a wrongful gain, because you're also benefiting from the increasing reach of the sport. A journalist or a business house that even if it runs a sponsored campaign is still promoting your event to a potentially new set of users. It's increasing the reach of the event. It's getting you more fans. More fans means that you can derive greater sponsorship revenue from your event. Your event has greater renown. It has a greater following. There's more participation in the event, the sport, as well as in your broadcast content. And all this is tangible data that you can collect.
Got it. Vidushi, so a lot of this now is coming out in codes of behavior. The fan coming to the stadium has to sign essentially ticket terms. Those ticket terms are standard form contract. A viewer watching is essentially signing up to their subscription package with a Tata Sky or someone else. There is very little negotiation between the behemoth sports body and the millions of fans who potentially have a collective action problem, right? One person is not going to advocate against a sports body where the sports body say, if you don't like these terms, just don't come to my stadium or don't watch my broadcast. Where is this conversation going to go? Because this is a public interest conversation in the long run. Yes, you have a commercial enterprise that is investing in an event, but it is also capturing public imagination, public interest. As you see, more Supreme Court precedent now talks about sport being a public good, which in some sense sports organizers are riding on, the notion of Indian teams. So the broader conversation, this is happening in terms of pushback by civil rights groups, public interest groups. There is no fan group in India. There's no one advocating for fans. Do you see a fans' rights sort of movement at some point of time? At what point is too much? Because right now, I'm a viewer, I come on your terms and I accept all of your terms and I have no option. Is there a future where fans will have rights?
That's a tough question. I mean, right at the outset, I think it's helpful to think of these huge sports conglomerates as gatekeepers, right? And if there's anything to learn from telecom law, it's that you need to question the monopoly that gatekeepers enjoy. And so, when we talk about fans' rights, I think that we aren't being as creative as we should be when it comes to looking at the law, and also looking at other avenues like the tech. So for instance, when you think about ticketing conditions, right, a lot of them wouldn't be allowed in a jurisdiction like the EU because the GDPR has very, very strong protections against the use of data, collection of data, ownership, etc., etc. So data protection law, I think, is one way. Another way is actually consumer law, because you could argue that fans are consumers having bought tickets, and I think, you know, this has worked in China when it comes to an authoritarian regime where, you know, the government doesn't care about your right to freedom of expression, and instead of using freedom of expression as the lens, you just use consumer protection. And I think that is something that is an opportunity, and I don't know much about sports law, to be honest, but I don't know if that has been examined as a particular framework. Another, I think, would be competition law, simply because it does seem like a monopolistic situation where there's no level playing field, there's no bargaining power. You know, you want to watch a match, you will watch a match. So you're not going to not go on the channel that has all these cannibalistic terms and conditions. So I think thinking of it as a jigsaw puzzle, right, instead of thinking of it as a a lateral sort of battle, is helpful. And I think especially when it comes to the use of new technologies, also thinking of how codes of conduct can integrate principles of privacy and rights within requirements that are in a technical sense.
Like you already see some of these strands in like mandatory sharing law, where you have to have the broadcast of the match on Doordarshan, news access, which news channels are allowed to use some amounts of footage. But perhaps in the long run, it's not just footage and match footage, but there are other ways in which you are allowed to go in and remix, add a layer of commentary, which anyone can subscribe to. So we're perhaps going to see many, many more iterations of sort of openness as this emerges. But I think it's been a fascinating debate. I'd just like all of you to end with a little bit of prediction of what is our future going to look like as events, as fans. What are we going to be surprised by? Any predictions which you'd like to make?
Well, I think we will have, it'll be very fragmented. I mean, a country of 1 billion people, we will have, I think, close to about very few, by very few I mean 500 million, yeah, signing up for sports. And I think as time goes on, you will see those becoming sharper and sharper, because once you start with them, they'll say, oh, I like cricket, I like football, I like tennis, I like basketball, etc. So going further, I think we'll sort of become like the US, wherein you will have one fan following maybe just one or two sports and playing. And what I see growing really, really fast here is the huge behemoth called esports, which is going to sort of pretty much take over a large chunk of physical sport.
Interesting.
In terms of the future, I think, like I mentioned earlier, that people from both sides of, or all the sides connected in terms of data, are getting cleverer in terms of the use of it. But there needs to be more aggressive participation from people like us in making people understand when we were talking about fans, and whether or not they will form some sort of collective in terms of understanding their usage of data. People nowadays, I feel, in the public are more concerned about privacy when it comes to social media and anything else, and they don't associate that same level of integrity when it comes to the clubs that they love. So they would share their data with them, not because they're not thinking about themselves, they're thinking about the entertainment that they're going to get. So there needs to be a level of understanding and education towards
what you're giving when you're
exactly.
getting something, right? Yeah.
So I mean, we work with data, we love data, and we want more of it, but we also want the people to know that, you know, this is what you're giving it for. And I don't think they assess that that's that same level of assessment when it comes to sport and entertainment.
And I think Orgo made a very important point. So earlier you were the product, and but as you move to the Internet of Things, you're paying and you are the product.
Exactly.
So I mean, the fact that you're paying makes you an even more elevated product of sorts. So
exactly.
I think people need to recognize how they're interacting, and in particularly in their commercial behavior. When you buy that ticket, when you buy that merchandise, you're almost going to another category of someone who's not only following sport but willing to spend. So you get into
exactly
sort of deeper and deeper territory. Not that you're buying your way out of privacy, you're buying your way out of profiling. In fact, you're going deeper.
Exactly, and I think that's where we're headed to in terms of the next couple of years from a fan perspective. From a corporation perspective, yes, we're going to continue trying to figure out who these fans are, and not in terms of obviously eventually commercializing, but also to provide a better experience. Because at the end of the day, sport is entertainment. We are all fans in some way or the other, whether it's football, cricket, or any other sport, or e-sport. And all we want to do is to enjoy watching it and be entertained. So everything else, in my opinion, actually takes a back seat. Data allows us, and we've always been fundamental to this, the data allows us to give our clients a better understanding into taking better decisions for the people who are watching the game. Simple as that. So we're actually all in it for them.
Great. Good. Abhinav?
I think the future is moving towards a changing role of the fan or the viewer. In the past, the fan has always been a consumer of sports content. Now, the fan is turning into someone who's engaging with the sports content. It's turning into a two-way conversation. It's no longer just a unilateral conversation where he's a recipient. So there will be greater...
How deep is that going to get? Am I going to have the right to choose a substitute in a football match sitting at home?
It's possible. And right now what's happening also is this engagement is going down right to the granular. So for example, in Euro basketball, you can get the perspective of the player through a camera. First Vision has activated this. So it's just starting to provide fans with a greater means of engaging with the sport and to have their voice heard.
And I think there's some motorsport now with the more fans that team has, the engine gets a little bit more power. So this is already happening in some sport, where if you show your fanhood for a particular driver, they get actually more horsepower in the engine.
It's happening.
And that's bound to happen as we go along, where reality TV and sport, I would say, come together, because you have a return path from the fan, right? Fan is, like you say, no longer viewer, is also feeding back.
It's also engaging.
Through social media, through other ways, live feedback.
What's important is sports organizers need to recognize that and create the circumstances for a fan to also participate in the event. Because
Excellent. Vidushi, any closing comments before we head into lunch?
I don't think I have a prediction, but I do have a hope, which is that I think instead of talking about data ownership, I do think that we'll start talking about data trust, because I think through legal mechanisms and also through growing awareness, I think hopefully there will be a more level playing field, say, in 10 years.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, all of you. While we, I think, have lunch following, you can follow up with specific questions to each of them over lunch. So I don't want to keep you from lunch.
May I request Biplav Gautam, Director of Global Business Development Strategy, Global Business Development Integrity Services at Sportradar, to please come and present our panelists with the mementos.